We're going to start with the front part of the Acorn house, and this is using the piece of chipboard that is 6 inches by 11 1/4. And we'll start by doing some preliminary marking. And the first line we want to draw, and you can draw this with pencil, I'm going to draw it with marker so that it will show up a little bit better for you, is at 1.5 inches along the length of the piece. And then we'll flip it around and we'll draw a line that is 2 inches from the other side. And now we're going to make a series of lines that are 1 1/8 inches apart, going across the length of the piece, and we should end up with 10 sections like this. I'm going to use my gridded mat to help me keep my ruler straight here as I move across. And I'll be back when I've accomplished that marking. So now I've accomplished my markings going across here at 1 1/8, and I'm going to mark for my windows and doors. And to do that, I want to make sure that I have the 2-inch wider section oriented towards the top. That's going to be the top of our Acorn house, and the 1.5-inch section is at the bottom. And so what we want to do is the door is going to go in these middle 2 sections, and it is going to be 2 sections wide, but it's going to have a couple of little notches cut off at the top just to give it a little bit of interest. So I'm marking 1/2 inch tick marks on each of these corners here, and I'll connect them, and then I think you'll be able to see what's going on. So here on the central section, I've marked and put in 2 45-degree corners there. And I want the door to be a little bit longer than this section, so I'm going to come and mark a line that is 1/4 inch below the line we drew going all the way across. So this is going to be our door. Now for the windows are going to go kind of skip a space on either side of the door, and we're going to draw a line that comes down 1/4 inch from the line we drew previously, each of these sections, and then 1.25 inches down from there, so that the window heights will be 1.25 inches. I'm going a little bit beyond each side of the sections, because the windows are actually going to be a little bit wider than one of our sections. In fact, 1/4 inch wide. So I'm going to mark that on either side. And then just to add a little bit interest to these windows as well, and you can measure if you want, but I'm just going to eyeball a 45-degree angle in each one of these corners. That's about 1/4 inch wide. It's not important that this is exactly precise, but you can measure and make tick marks like we did for the door if you would like. So now we have our door and our 2 windows marked. So now we're ready to do a little bit of cutting, and what we want to do is cut out little wedges so that at the bottom each of these sections that's 1 1/8 inch is in the middle is only 1 inch at the bottom. Now if you would be more comfortable measuring and making little tick marks at 1/16 inch on either side of these lines, you can go ahead and do that. I'm going to just eyeball it and put my blade where it should go, and then come up to the intersection and cut out that wedge each time. So for instance, right here, I'm a 1/16 of an inch on to the right of this line, and I will just cut a diagonal from the intersection up here. To the bottom. And then I'll put my blade a 1/16 of an inch on the other side of that line, and again go up to this intersection. Now I should be able to cut out a little wedge here. Now I think you can see that little wedge that's been cut out. Now we're going to repeat that, going all the way across at the bottom, and then flip it around and do the same thing at the top. Don't forget to cut out a 1/16 of an inch on the edges so that you get a little wedge off of the end pieces as well. So I'll be back when I've accomplished that. So I finished cutting out all the little wedges. I just put this piece of brown cardstock behind here so that you could more easily see all the little wedges that have been cut out. So now I'm going to make the cuts for the door and the windows. So I finished cutting my 2 windows. Before I finish cutting out the door, I have taken a moment just to number the pieces here, and we'll number them all the way across 1 through 10 on both the top and the bottom. Because obviously when I cut out the door, pieces 5 and 6 that are right below the door are going to become loose. Now pieces 5 and 6 at the top will be held on because of this little corner, but they may become loose later on, so we will, this ensures that we keep them in order. And I'm planning to just score to make the bends here, but if any of the scores go too deep, this will also ensure that the pieces stay in the right order should they become separated. So now that I've finished cutting out the door, you can see that the 2 pieces have split in half. At the top, pieces 5 and 6 are still attached, but here I've just put 5 and 6 back in so you can see where they go. So we'll just keep track of these little guys here to the side. Our next step is going to be to lightly score on the 2 horizontal lines, and then we'll make more predominant scores through the vertical lines, but just through up to where the wedges were cut out. Now I have all the scoring done on these pieces, and that will allow them to bend to form the shape. And we're just going to put this side pieces aside until we complete the other the section that makes joins up and makes the back side of the acorn. This is the back side of the acorn house. It starts with the piece that is 6 inches tall by 7 7/8 inches long, which allows for 7 of the 1 1/8 inch sections. And so I've numbered these 11 through 17. And I think you can see that I've done some preliminary cutting here. I again measured 2 inches down from the top and made a line across, and 1.5 inches up from the bottom, made a line across, and then cut out the little wedges so that the base of each section is now 1 inch wide. And now I'm going to mark for a smaller door and a couple of small windows on this back side. So in the middle section, which is section 14, we're going to put a small door, and this door will go all the way up to the 2 inch marking, but it's going to stop at 1/4 of an inch shy of the bottom, so that from the bottom to the bottom of the door is 1 3/4 inches. And then again, I'm just going to eyeball this, but the door for this part is only 1 section wide, and so I'm just going to knock off the corners here on either side. And then I'm going to put a small window, skip a section between the door on either side, so in 12 and 16 we'll put a small window, and we're going to start these windows down 1/4 inch from the 2 inch line, or 2 1/4 from the top, and then the windows will be 1 inch tall. And then again, let's knock off approximately 1/4 inch, a 45-degree angle on each of the corners, just to make them a little more interesting. And these windows also are only 1 section wide, so a little bit smaller here on the back side. So let's get those cut out, and then we'll do our scoring just like we did on the front, and we'll be ready to proceed from there. So now it's time to make the Acorn house 3-dimensional, and I'm just going to use some cardstock joining strips that I've cut 3/4 of an inch wide, scored down the center, and then added 1/4 inch score tape on either side. Now, when we reinforce this, we want to go the entire length, or to ensure that we get the sections that are in the middle that don't look like they're cut, but we want to make sure that we're going to reinforce them. Now, it may be easier to see where you need to center that by just on that crease making a line, just so you can see that a little bit better. And before you start, you'll want to gently bend on all of the scores that we've made. So, for instance, on this one it'll go top to bottom, but here underneath the windows, we'll start right underneath the windows and come down to the bottom. And as you go, you'll see that because we cut those wedges out, it will become start to form a 3-dimensional shape. Now I'm going to join this into 2 sections to begin with, just like we cut it. The front section with 10 pieces, and the back section that has the remaining 7. So let me do that, and then we will be back to see what's next. So I have the front section and the back section put together with the cardstock joining strips, and I made sure to burnish each one of these, holding it in the proper position, rounding it as necessary. And before I join these 2 sections, which I'll just do with 2 long joining strips that I have here, I'm going to do some inking in between the long joins here. You can see I've started over here. I'm just using gathered twigs, which is kind of my go-to color, but depending on what paper you're going to cover the acorn with, you may choose a different color. So I'm just going to, like I said, ink all the vertical edges, and then I will join the two sections with these long strips, and then we'll be back to see what's next. Now it's time to cover the side of the acorn house with a pattern paper, and I have chosen the back side of the paper named Once Upon a Springtime Cut Apart. So you can see here it's kind of a small tannish yellow check, and I've cut a strip that's 6 inches tall by the width of the paper. And then what I'm going to do is, just like we did when we constructed the walls of the house, I'm going to make a line, and I'm working on the back side of the paper here, that is 2 inches from the top and 1.5 inches from the bottom. And then I'm going to mark vertical lines, but instead of using 1 1/8 like we did when we constructed the house out of chipboard, I want to have a little bit of a reveal, so I'm going to mark these lines 1 1/16 inch apart. So now that I have all of my 1 1/16 inch vertical markings here, I'm going to remove wedges just like we did when we did the chipboard, except for these will be slightly smaller. Instead of coming a 1/16 on either side of the vertical lines for each wedge, I'm just going to come 32nd or eyeball, just something that is kind of just a small sliver of a wedge coming out both on the top and the bottom. So I'm going to do that for each one of these. So I've put my pattern paper on top of this piece of brown cardstock so that you can see all the little wedges that I've cut out. And now I'm just going to flip it again back over to the back side and cut in the middle section to cut these strips apart. So I've got 11 to start with here, and I've done some inking. I used brushed corduroy just lightly on the edges, and I'm just going to use 1/4 inch score tape, which I can bend around the little curves here. And one thing to keep in mind as you're putting these on, there is a top and a bottom, because remember the top section is cut down to 2 inches, the wedges, and the bottom is just 1.5 inches. It's easy to keep them oriented because the back side has some text on it, so you can use that to help you keep them oriented correctly. Now for any of the strips that are full length, it's just a simple matter of removing the score tape backing. Making sure you're oriented correctly. And then putting the strip down in place. Now you can see that the next one here, take this little scrap, has a little cutout here for the window. So what I'm going to do for that is I'm going to take some temporary adhesive and just put a strip of that on there, and then bring it over here, put it in place, And then I can just turn it towards the inside, and I'm sure this is difficult to see, but I'm just marking on the inside where that opening is on the piece of pattern paper. And I can take this off, and there's a section right here that I've drawn the line for. I'm going to cut it just on the outside of that so I can have just a tiny bit of reveal. That's probably not going to show once we get our window treatments in, but just in case we change our mind or you decide not to have your window treatments like I'm going to do mine, that'll keep things consistent. So now I've cut out this little wedge, and now I can put my score tape around this piece and put it on. And then I'll just proceed around, and then if I do end up needing more, there's, I'm sure I'm going to need a few more strips of the pattern paper. I have the other half of the sheet that I can cut a few more. So that's what I'm going to do now. Now we're going to start working on the windows, and I've saved my little cutouts from the front windows, which are slightly bigger, and the back windows here, so that I'll be able to use them to trace and get the outline for the inside of each window. Now I've cut 2 pieces of medium weight chipboard to start with to make the frames for the windows. And I've got one that's 1 3/4 by 4.5, and one that's 1 5/8 by 3, but you could just use some scraps that are big enough. What I want to do is make the window frame be 1/4 of an inch bigger than the outline of each of the cutouts. And so I'm going to trace those around and then cut out the inside and cut the diagonals and get my 4 little frames. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll be back. So I finished cutting out the window frames, and I also have cut out some pattern paper and backed it with some score tape, and I'm going to use that to cover the frames. I'm going to wrap the edges, so I'm going to cut pieces of this that are 1/4 inch wider than the frames on all 4 sides, and then we'll wrap one, and I'll do that for you here. So let me cut this. So now that we have all of our frames covered with patterned paper, it's time to attach them to the Acorn House. And I think I'll start with the back ones. And what I want to do is cut some slits going up to the edge here in the center. Let me zoom in a little bit. So I'm going to just kind of come in from each of these points on the frame, because what we're going to do is attach this, use those to wrap around to the inside and cover the edges, the inside edges of the frame. So I'm just making those slits, and then I'm just going to extend them so that I can make a line here in the middle, and they can all join up. Okay, I think that should do it. And then I should be able, oh, this one needs a little bit more right there. Now I should be able just to push on this, and all of these will kind of spring inwards. And then that will help cover the inside edges of the window. And then we'll use some glue to attach this onto the house. Now this, I can see my little L here, so that means it goes on this left window when it's oriented towards the door. And I'm also just going to give it a slight little bend, especially on the corners here, because of course the Acorn house is curved, or a series of flat sections that kind of mimic a curve. So just kind of to get this to fit a little bit closer around here. And now let's just do a dry fit. We can see how that's going to go on the window here. I'll put some glue on here, and then we can put it on. So now we have all of the frames on, so let's work on the window panes themselves. And I've cut kind of a generous piece of plastic here. You could use scrap plastic. This is a pretty flimsy weight here because we're going to have to curve it around on the inside of the window panes. And what I want to do is just use some alcohol inks to give it kind of, I think, a golden tone. You can obviously color it with whatever colors you want. I've got several out here to start with. I have butterscotch, ginger, latte, and then I have some of the copper mixative. And so I'm just going to cover my plastic with some color. Now eventually I'm going to put some LED tea lights inside of the windows, and so that's why I'm kind of doing some extra steps on them here. Alright. And just pounce around until you get a color you like, or change it up however you want. So now that I'm happy with the inking that I've done on my plastic, I'm going to cut it into some pieces to use for the window panes. And the front will be 2 1/4 wide by 1 3/4 tall, and the back will be 1 5/8 inches wide by 1 1/2 inches tall. So let me cut those and then we'll be back. So I've got my pieces of plastic cut out, and I want to add a little interest by putting some mullions on the windows. You can see I've done that on this one here. And what I'm doing is just kind of imitating where those the little diagonal cuts have been made. So you could draw this out and connect the lines, but I think what I'll do is just put this on plastic on top of the window cutout here, and then I put some score tape on the back of a strip of kind of off-white colored paper, and then I cut some 1/16 of an inch wide strips, and I can just remove the score tape and make some mullions coming across here, just kind of by, I'm going to go across the whole thing, but I'm just going to connect the diagonal corners there, and then use you can use craft knife or scissors to cut that off, and just kind of keep that in place and put the next one in. And turn it 90 degrees and make sure it's all still lined up nicely. And then we'll put a couple going the other way. Oops, kind of getting off camera, sorry. There we go. Sometimes it's a little hard to get the tape backing to start wanting to come off. So just making this cross hatch from the diagonals. It won't show, obviously. You don't have to go all the way to the edges. I just find it easier to do. And then working on a piece of paper like this, I can shift it around without disturbing the cardboard cutout underneath. So there's our mullions, and I'll just flip it over and kind of give it a burnish. You can burnish with your bone folder too, of course. And then what we want to do is add, I'm using a 1/4" score tape. I'm kind of hanging over the edge a little bit because the 1/4" is just a little bit too wide, but you could use 1/8" too. Either way, just kind of, and I'm putting this on the side that we just added the mullions to. All the way around all 4 edges here. And then we'll give that a little bit of a burnish. Okay. Now we'll remove the backing. Fold up these edges a little bit that were hanging over just by lightly putting a finger on them. And then just as a little added insurance, I'm using some diamond glaze and dots around the edges. You could also use glossy accents. This was just handy, so I'm using that. And I'm just putting a series of dots, and again, and they're small dots, just around, just on top of the score tape. And this is just some added insurance because we're working with those curves. And then I find it best, and I don't know if you'll be able to see this, I'm going to work from the I'm kind of working on the inside of this, and I can look through the other openings and make sure I'm getting the lines all lined up properly. So I know you can't see this, but I'll flip it over here in a second, and then you'll be able to see what I've accomplished. I'm just putting it down lightly at first, just so I can check and see if I've got it in the right place. And so I can see that it needs to be moved over a little bit. Maybe I'll try doing it just from the front side here. That looks pretty good. And then now I'm just going to give it a good press, and you could even burnish on those sides. Just watch out if you're going to use your bone folder to burnish, that if there's any extra diamond glaze or glossy accents, that you get that wiped off of your bone folder. I'm just using my fingers. And there is the window, and put some paper in here. It's a little hard to see in this light. It's gotten dark now, but I can see the golden color of the window. So I'll repeat that for the remaining windows, and then we'll be able to move on.